Hey everyone, I've got an interesting list of historical fiction books to help you fill up your TBR. Now, the way I came up with this list is someone actually commented a very interesting comment on one of my videos. This person asked me to come up with a list of historical fiction books that don't have to do with war. And I thought this is a very interesting comment because while historical fiction, to me, is my favorite genre, I love historical fiction, it tends to deal with some very difficult topics. A lot of times, it tends to deal with war, specifically World War II, but there's many historical fiction books out there that deal with other wars. Historical fiction tends to be pretty heavy, even though it's my favorite genre. Like I said, there are times when I just feel like I need to have a little palate cleanser, I need to read something else, because it can be quite heavy. So when I was thinking about this list, I was trying to think of books that really dealt with, really some just, good old-fashioned social unrest. Because, while there are books that don't technically deal with war, like, for example, The Underground Railroad by Colson Whitehead and Kindred by Octavia Butler, these don't technically deal with war, but they do deal with something just as brutal as war, and that is slavery in the United States. So while I do highly recommend these two books, if you're looking for historical fiction that isn't brutal, I wouldn't recommend these books. So that being said, here's my list of historical fiction books that don't deal with war. Not to say that these books don't deal with hard topics, but they are on a little bit more of the lighthearted side, at least as far as you can say in terms of historical fiction. Because again, historical fiction just tends to deal with periods of history, of human history, that's a little bit tough. Now, the first book that I thought of was The Giver of Stars by Jojo Moyes. So this book is about a woman, an English woman, who comes over to the United States because she marries a guy. She is living in Kentucky, and she gets involved with the Kentucky Pack Horse Library. This is a library that was run almost exclusively by women, and it got books to some of the poorest people in Kentucky. This book has a very interesting murder mystery that goes along with it. So not only does it talk about a particularly interesting period of history, but it also has a taut and compelling murder mystery that goes along with it. And while it does deal with, difficult topics and, there is some violence in it, I wouldn't say it's the type of violence that you're going to be finding in, some all-out war. Now, another one I thought of was City of Girls by Elizabeth Gilbert. And while this technically does take place partly during World War II, the main character of this novel is a woman, and she's an American woman. And while she is, like everyone, affected by the war in certain ways, it doesn't dwell on the war. I'd say it's more about her life in sort of the theater world of New York City. I was actually quite surprised by this book, quite surprised by how much I loved this book. I just thought the plotting was very good and unexpected, so that's one that you could try. The Revenant by Michael Punke. This is another one that you might want to try. So this is about the Rocky Mountain Fur Trading Company in the 1820s in the United States. It's about a man who is attacked by a grizzly bear, and he is left for dead. And not only is he left for dead, but he isn't even given a chance to survive. So the men who are left with him to essentially, comfort him until he dies, they basically abandon him, and they don't give him a chance of survival because they take everything of his that he could use for survival. His gun, his knives, his food, everything. So it is a fast-paced story of revenge as well as a historical fiction novel. What the Wind Knows by Amy Harmon is a book about Ireland in the 1920s. So obviously it's about social unrest, it's about Irish independence. There is some violence in it, there is some danger in it, but it's not the, all-out just destruction of a war where, you have, women and children being bombed and that sort of thing. Now this book, The Secret Book of Flora Lee. Now, while technically this book does take place in World War II, it's not really about World War II, it's about a particular event that happened in World War II. Operation Pied Piper in Great Britain, where basically, tons of children that were in London were sent into the countryside to be taken care of by families while their parents had to remain in London to work. I say parents, I mean specifically mostly women, right? Mostly the women were staying in London, the mothers were staying in London to work to help with the war effort, and then the children were living with people in the countryside. Now, this is the story of the mystery of a missing child, and I don't usually like to read stories about missing children, but it becomes very obvious, like I'm not giving away any spoilers here, just from how this book is written from the beginning, that the missing child is still alive, so it's not like you're trying to figure out how she was murdered or something like that. It's just obvious that she's still alive, so you're trying to figure out what happened and where is she. This book was very fast-paced and I really enjoyed it. Now, if you're looking for some classics, Les Miserables is technically historical fiction. A lot of people think that this book is about the French Revolution. It's actually not. There is a very important scene in this book, and a lot of this book does revolve around the 1832 June Rebellion in Paris, but I wouldn't really call it a war. I mean, technically it was violent. It was a period of social unrest, but I would classify it more as, you know, a period of unrest rather than all-out brutal war. Les Miserables is a very long book. It is very tedious in parts. However, if it's something that you're interested in, I highly recommend it. I do think it's worth the effort that is required to get through the book. I'm very glad that I read it. The book Kristin Lavransdatter, which is technically 3 books in one, but there is a recording now. I actually listened to this one that is just all 3 books in one. Very long, I think about 47 hours, but it is a historical fiction book. It's about a Norwegian woman in the Middle Ages. I mean, of course there's violence during the Middle Ages. I mean, that's just the way it was, but it was more about medieval life, and particularly the life of this particular woman, Kristin Lavransdatter. You know, I felt like I learned a lot about medieval life by reading this book. If you're interested and you don't want to commit to the whole thing, I feel like you could just read the first book and, you know, be happy with that and be good with that. I do think it's worth reading at least the first book, but that's another book that's historical fiction but isn't technically about war. Now, this book, The Color Purple, while this book is very brutal in parts, it deals with some very hard topics. It deals with, obviously, serious racism in the United States, beginning from, you know, the early 1900s on into after World War II, and there's some hard topics that are talked about in this novel, you know, domestic abuse, sexual abuse, extreme poverty, racism, these sorts of things. I just felt that the overall tone of this novel was so uplifting at the end that it was worth all of the hard things, although I would not classify this book as lighthearted in any way. So, you know, I just wanted to put this one out there, but if you're looking for more lighthearted material, I definitely wouldn't classify this. But if you're looking for some more fluff, Night Over Water by Ken Follett is an option. Even though it takes place during World War II, it's not really about World War II, it's about a very famous airplane, the Pan Am Clipper, and I believe it's its last flight ever from Europe to the United States, and it's basically about this cast of characters on this particular flight and what happens to them. If you've never read Ken Follett, he's really just known for, you know, his ability to get you to turn the page. I found this book quite interesting. I enjoyed it a lot. I wouldn't say that it was, you know, any great piece of work or anything like that, but it was historical fiction along a more lighthearted thread. Another book by Ken Follett, A Place Called Freedom. This is a book that it's not about a war. It's essentially about a man, a Scottish man if I'm remembering correctly, but he basically is sent to the Americas because he's a thief, and it's basically, you know, the story of his life there, but told in a very Ken Follett way where you are wanting to turn the pages, right? I mean, he's a thriller writer, so he's doing this in a way that a thriller writer would. Now, for a book that is, you know, pretty lighthearted, I would say, although quite good. I mean, this is true classic literature, and it is historical fiction, and that is Middlemarch by George Eliot. So this book is about a cast of characters in Midlands, England, and it all takes place around what is known as the Reform era in the 19th century. And I was quite surprised just by how much I really liked this book and how much towards the end because I actually listened to this book, I couldn't stop listening to it. It was quite good. I will say that the language is quite archaic. I did have to stop many times to look up words, but, you know, after I got into it, I just absolutely adored this book. And it is historical fiction, and there's not anything, you know, brutal about this book in any way, shape, or form. Now, this book, Trust by Hernan Diaz. So this book, I would say the historical event that really surrounds this book is the crash of the stock market in 1929. So it's kind of like 4 books in one dealing with this crash. It's very beautifully written. It has a lot of Edith Wharton vibes, I would say. A lot of people say that they were surprised by the ending of this book. I actually thought the ending was quite predictable, but that was just me. I mean, I do think this book is worth reading. It was quite a beautiful book. It is historical fiction, and it doesn't deal with war. Clan of the Cave Bear is another historical fiction book that deals with historical events, although I don't know how accurate these historical events are because it obviously deals with very early humans, so when humans were around and Neanderthals were still around as well. So it's about a young girl, a young human, who is separated from her parents, and she's taken up by a group of Neanderthals and kind of like their story together. So obviously much of this is imagined because I don't know how much documentation there really is about early humans, but it's a great book, and it is technically historical fiction, and there are parts of it that are quite brutal, as you might imagine, but it doesn't deal with war, and it's a great book. Cutting for Stone by Abraham Verghese. Now, I don't believe technically it deals with war, although it does deal with the coup that took place in Ethiopia in the 1970s, and there are some really brutal aspects of this book. It's not technically dealing with war. It really more just deals with the life of a particular character. He is a twin. He's got a twin brother. His mother was actually an Indian nun living in Ethiopia. His father was a British doctor who abandoned him and his brother when he was born. His mother died, and it's really the story of their life. There are a lot of really specific medical scenes in this book, however. The author of this book, Abraham Verghese, he is a doctor, so he specifically describes some pretty insane operations. I mean, I just remember one thing where he was describing where the main character, was operating on this person who had been in an accident, and then just the amount of blood that was spilling over and how it soaked his shoes. So I don't know, if you're looking for something that's a little bit lighthearted, I don't know if that qualifies, but technically it's not about a war. Now, Kazuo Ishiguro is an author you might want to check out if you are interested in historical fiction, but you don't want stories that are dealing with war. Now, I use this with a little caveat here, because technically he really likes to write about wars, but in the aftermath of the war. So you're not really dealing with the horror of the war per se. It's more the ramifications of what characters did in the war and what that means now. So check out his backlist of books. He has many books. Not all of them are about this, but he has quite a few that deal more with the aftermath of war. And then lastly, The Pillars of the Earth. This doesn't deal with any particular war per se. It is about a cast of characters in the 12th century in England as they sort of orbit the building of a cathedral. So it all centers around the building of a cathedral. And you may think, oh, that sounds kind of boring, and I guess it kind of does. However, it's not boring. Or let me take that back. The first half of this book is a little slow, I will say that. However, the second half, absolutely just, you'll be racing through it. And while it isn't technically about war, there are some pretty brutal scenes in this book. So if you don't want any brutality at all, maybe don't try this book. But if you can handle a little, great book. Well, I hope this list helps you find some books, some historical fiction books that don't deal with war.